All right, let's tackle a big one today, postmodernism. You've probably heard this term thrown around, right? A lot of times it sounds super complicated, or maybe even like an insult. But honestly, it's one of the most important ideas for understanding the world we live in right now. So let's dive in and see if we can make some sense of it all.
I mean, have you ever just looked around and felt like the big, grand ideas we were all told to believe in, about endless progress or clear-cut rules for how society works, that they just don't quite fit anymore? That feeling? That sense of uncertainty and things being a little jumbled? Well, that's exactly what postmodern thinkers were trying to get at.
To really get postmodernism, you kind of have to know what it was reacting against, and that was modernism. The modernist era was all about a huge belief in progress, order, and finding universal truths. Think of science discovering laws that explain everything everywhere. Modernism was like having one single perfect blueprint for building society. Postmodernism comes along, looks at that blueprint, and asks, hey, what if there isn't just one blueprint? What if it's more like a collage, made of all these different pieces that don't always fit together perfectly? It swaps that search for one big truth with a healthy dose of skepticism that says, hey, maybe there are many truths, many different stories. So keeping that in mind, what exactly is postmodernism at its heart? Well, if you boil it all down, it's about skepticism. It's a major reaction to all the certainty and confidence of the modern era. It started to question everything, the very foundations of how we know, what's real, and even who we are.
So what is postmodernism? Okay, think of it like this. It's a huge movement of thought that's really suspicious of any single story that claims to explain everything. A big part of it is pointing out how much our language shapes our world. And it seriously challenges this idea that we can ever get a perfect, unfiltered look at objective reality.
Let's start with our first big idea here, which really builds on that skepticism. This one comes from a French philosopher, Jean-François Lyotard, and it's probably the most famous concept in all of postmodernism. He called it the end of grand narratives.
So what on earth is a grand narrative? Well, it's one of those giant, sweeping stories a culture tells itself to make sense of its own history and purpose. For example, the story that humanity is always getting better and better through science and reason. Or the story that history is all about a class struggle that will eventually lead to a perfect, liberated society. These are the big stories that claim to have all the answers.
And this quote from Lyotard just nails it. He basically said that the defining feature of our time, the postmodern condition, is that we just don't buy into those all-encompassing stories anymore. We've become skeptical, or as he puts it, incredulous. After the massive wars and upheavals of the 20th century, the idea that one single story could explain everything began to feel not just a little naive, but maybe even dangerous. Okay. So if we can't trust the big stories anymore, what about, well, reality itself? Now, this is where things get really wild and kind of mind-bending. Let's look at another major thinker, Jean Baudrillard. He argued that in our world, which is just drenched in media, the line between what's real and what's just an image has started to totally dissolve. Baudrillard had a name for this, hyperreality. It's this weird state where we don't really experience the world directly anymore. Instead, we experience it through this endless river of media, social media, advertisements, signs and symbols. And after a while, these copies and simulations don't just represent reality. They become our reality. The copy, in a way, becomes more real than the original ever was.
Now, Baudrillard actually broke this down into 4 stages, which is pretty cool. First, you have the image as a faithful copy of something real. Simple enough. But then, in stage 2, the image starts to twist that reality a bit. Then, stage 3, the image starts pretending to be the real thing, but it's really just hiding the fact that there's no original reality behind it anymore. And finally, you get to stage 4, the pure simulacrum. This is an image that has zero connection to any reality whatsoever. It's become its own thing. Like, think about Disney's Main Street USA. It refers to a version of America that never actually existed. It's its own pure reality. And this whole process leads to what Baudrillard famously called the desert of the real. It's this feeling of living in a world made up entirely of these simulations. Think about Las Vegas, right? You've got a fake Eiffel Tower, a fake pyramid, a whole city built on copies of things, completely disconnected from their original meaning. Or think of a reality TV show that's scripted to feel more real than our actual lives. In these spaces, the simulation doesn't just represent the world, it completely replaces it.
So, if the grand stories have fallen apart and reality itself is dissolving into a simulation, what does that mean for us, for our own sense of identity? Well, this brings us to the next big idea, the postmodern self, which was explored by thinkers like Stuart Hall.
See, Hall argued that our whole idea of a self has shifted over time. In pre-modern times, your identity was pretty much fixed from birth. You knew your place in the social and religious order. Then, in the modern era, we got this idea of the individual having a solid core self, but it was still held in place by big things like your nationality or your job. But in the postmodern world, that stable core self gets de-centered. Our identities are seen now as more fragmented, shifting, and sometimes even contradictory. We wear different hats in different situations. So what's behind all this fragmentation? Well, there are a few huge forces at play. Globalization means we're exposed to countless different cultures, not just the one we were born into. We have more options for who we want to be. The rise of new social movements around gender, race, and sexuality totally challenged all the old fixed categories. And of course, there's consumerism. We're constantly told that we can build our identity, express our true self through the stuff we buy.
And that last point leads us to a really crucial, critical perspective on postmodernism. What if all this fragmentation, this loss of a stable reality, isn't just some abstract philosophical shift? What if it's directly connected to the economic system we live in?
This is the huge argument made by the theorist Frederick Jameson. He basically said that the culture of postmodernism, its style, its feel, its whole vibe, isn't an accident. It's the perfect cultural reflection of a new stage of capitalism, global, consumer-driven, and lightning fast. The culture we see is just the logic of our economy made visible.
Jameson gives us a great example of this from the art world. He draws a line between modern parody and postmodern pastiche. See, a parody makes fun of an original style. It has a bite to it, a critical edge, because it assumes there's a normal way of doing things that it can mock. But pastiche, he calls that blank parody. It's just a neutral imitation, a collage of different styles from the past, but with no critical message. It's all surface. For Jameson, this loss of depth in history was a direct symptom of our capitalist culture.
So there you have it, postmodernism in a nutshell. A huge dose of skepticism towards big stories, a world where the line between real and simulation is blurry, a self that feels more fluid and fragmented, and a culture that might just be the perfect mirror for global capitalism. And it leaves us with a really big question, doesn't it? Does getting rid of those old, rigid stories actually make us free to create our own meaning? Or does it just leave us kind of lost, wandering through a consumerist hall of mirrors with no clear way out? It's a question these thinkers were asking decades ago, and man, it feels more relevant today than ever.